Okay, so there we have our 7 elements of visual arts. We have line, we have shape and form, we have texture and color, we have size, and we have depth. So let's see if we can combine all of these, integrate them all with a couple of photographs that I took. Well, I guess in this case, this is a picture of me, not one that I took. But let's see if we can go down the list and spot some of these elements in the following 2 photographs. Let's see what we can spot in our image here. So the first thing we went through, our first element was line. So do we see any actual lines in here? We see some. The outlines of the mountains would be considered, or I guess no, that would be more considered shape because they're intersecting lines, right? So when we're talking about lines, I don't see any actual lines. The roads down here, even though they're kind of hidden by the haze, the fog. But we have our horizon, of course. We have our psychological lines of my gaze moving out this way. And we have a leading line, if you remember what that is. It's an implied line that helps our eyes move through the image. And we have a bit of a leading line with this path, because the path goes towards me. And then we have our leading line, our implied line, and then our psychological line moving us into the photograph. Shape, as I had just kind of mentioned already, we have the shape of the mountains, those intersecting lines creating those mountainous shapes. Form, we have me. We can tell that I'm pretty three-dimensional. We can tell that our mountains are three-dimensional based on the tone changes, right? Depending on, especially this part of the hill right here. You can see the dark part versus the light part. We can see that in this shadow here and the rocks. So we have a lot of form in there. Texture, we can see a lot more softness because of the fog over here versus the hard, rigid, rough textures of the rocks. Colors. The colors are pretty muted in this picture, aren't they? The blues are pretty light. We don't have any, deep blues. We don't have any really deep greens except for around here, but again, they're very dark, right? When we talked about that value or the luminance, which we saw in Adobe Lightroom, very low luminance with our greens, except maybe around right here. Our blue had very high luminance. And yeah, there's not a lot of, saturation in this photo. Meaning when we have blue, it doesn't look like a pencil crayon blue up here, right? When we have green, it doesn't look like a pencil crayon green. Yellows don't look very strong yellow. They're more kind of like, I guess, pastel-ish kind of colors. A bit more muted, we might say. Size, having me in here definitely helps give some context to the mountain we're standing on. But having the city down here and having just all the other mountains around each other gives us some context for how big the mountains might be. But yeah, having me in the picture definitely helps with how big is this path compared to everything else. And lastly, we have depth. So this image has so much depth to it because every single mountain you see here has different tones to it. It gets from very bright over here to a little bit darker, darker, until, okay, now we're actually seeing quite a bit of darkness and some more color in here as opposed to like the haziness of the further away mountains. Until we get to our foreground area here, where we can actually see a lot of color, a lot of detail, and a lot of light as we move our way along this path towards me. So we see a lot of depth here. And yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say about this photo regarding the 7 elements. I'm sure you can probably spot more. Shape. Yeah, we don't really see any geometric shapes. Everything seems pretty natural. Like even the sun, which we might expect to be very circular, in this picture isn't so circular, right? Just because of how bright it is. Yeah, we do see some roads that are pretty straight looking, so that would be a geometric shape. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to discuss about this one. And here's another image that I did take. This is at Lindeman Lake also in Chilliwack. Similar area, but not the same mountain. So let's go through our list again. Do we see any lines? I mean, we do see a stick in here, but it doesn't really do anything for the photo. If I went back to re-edit this photo, I'd definitely take that out, which I'll show you how to do when we go through photo editing. My bracelet, I guess you could say, would be a curved line, right? Everything else would be kind of implied, like we have our horizon, which is, it's not really an actual horizon line. This definitely helps show us an implied horizon. Do we have a psychological line? Yeah, I guess with the bird's kind of gaze down right at its food into my hand. But we do have another leading line. Again, a leading line is that implied or psychological line that helps the viewer of our photograph. It helps their eye move through the photograph. So in this case, it's going to be my arm. My arm is a leading line towards the subject of the photograph, which is this cute little gray jay right here. Okay, shape. I guess really shape of the bird, its feathers, right? Shape of the lake, the hills. When we start talking about form, how 3D things are, yeah, we definitely see a lot of tonality changes in the bird and its feathers. You know, the top part of the bird versus its underside, right? Just the shadow change. Same with my hand. The top part of my hand has all the light, the bottom part has the shadow. Texture, again, that rapid change in tonality shows us that this bird isn't, it's probably soft, but it's not like a smooth surface. We have a lot of these tiny little hair feathers in here, versus maybe these feathers on its wings would definitely be a bit more smoother, right? Top of its head might be a little bit wet by the looks of things, because that change in tonality, the texture shows us that. And we might have been able to see if the snow was softer or harder, if it was more in focus and we got more detail, like we saw in the texture video. Is this snow very soft and powdery, or is it a bit more hard, crunchy? And I think it was a bit more hard and crunchy, and you can kind of tell just by its shape. If this was powdery snow, you wouldn't kind of see these hard shadows. It would definitely be more smoother transitions in its shape. Or its form, I should say. Colors. I remember definitely darkening and desaturating the greens a little bit in the trees. So we don't see very saturated greens. A little bit over here is definitely more saturated, but the luminance or the value is low. The hue of this is definitely a dark green, where over here you might get a lighter green. The bird doesn't have a lot of color to it. Yeah, the rest of the image doesn't have a lot of color either. Everything else is pretty natural. Or not natural, just muted colors or tones, like gray tones. Size, my hand being in the image definitely helps give us context for how big this bird is. If my hand wasn't in there at all, we wouldn't really know how big the bird is, because we wouldn't be able to tell how close it was to the camera or how far away it was, right? So my hand in there definitely helps us with size. As well as, I guess, the mountains and the trees in the background kind of helps a little bit too, this log. And depth. Here we can see the blurry background helps us with our depth a little bit more. We have a bit of lines in the lake converging on each other, showing us that this part of the lake is further away than this part of the lake. Yeah, so our foreground, bird, and my arm. Midground, I would say, would be the log and this part of the lake here. And then it quickly gets into the background over here. So yeah, not a lot of changes in tonality to show us the depth. But again, the blurriness is really what shows us that this image has some depth to it, some 3D, right? This sharp imaged bird stands out against the blurry background. So we know that this bird is closer to us than the background is. If everything was in the exact same focus, everything was crystal clear focus, the bird wouldn't stand out as much. It might not look as close as the background does, and we would call that a shallow depth of field. Or sorry, it would be the opposite of shallow. depth of field. But we'll get into that terminology when we start talking photo composition, so don't worry about that too yet. Just know we want some depth to our image, or we usually do. And that's it. Those are our 7 elements.